Hello, everybody.
Wait. I think my camera's broken.
That's okay. Most people leave them off. All right, we're going to give it just another minute because we do have an Explain It to the Media quiz today, and I want to try to get as many people in here as possible before we start. Alrighty. So while the people are getting signed on here, just a quick note that you should be getting your midterm progress reports, I think either tomorrow or Friday via WebAdvisor. For this class, I did them today, so they won't reflect this quiz, obviously. I only put in comments if you're struggling in the class, so do pay attention to those, and please feel free to chat with me about any questions you have relevant to that. But if you just go on Blackboard, you can also see in your grade center the information I'm giving. So nothing should be a giant surprise. Couple reminders: do your Connect assignments. Make sure you're doing those. Make sure you're here on quiz days. We do have an exam coming up again next week, so we'll talk more about that on Monday. It'll be the same format as exam 1. And yeah, the other thing is that if you look on your syllabus, you are supposed to have a meeting with me at some point, and the vast majority of you have not done that. So think about doing that. You get 10 points just for doing that. And then I sent you an email last night with a link and instructions on how to sign up for the psychological experience credit studies. So certainly take a look at that because those are due at the end of the semester. If you want to set up meetings, good question. It is, I'll put the link in the...
Oh, by the end of the semester, right?
Yes, yeah. Ideally, I wanted it early in the semester. But yeah, if you can do it, anytime by the end of the semester, that's fine.
I'm trying to find it. Any chance you could resend it to me?
Resend the link. I just put it in the chat here. And it's also on the syllabus, and it's also on Blackboard. So,
thank you.
And people who are writing me stuff in the chat right now, while you all are taking your quiz, I'll type back to each of you individually. So, you are gonna do your explain to the media quiz. I'll give you till 1:20-ish. If we need longer, we can take longer. So again, Blackboard, our class, and exams, quizzes. And it should be the only thing visible there. So go ahead and start taking that. And then if you have questions, please put them in the chat so that you don't disturb other people taking their quiz. Alrighty, it looks like most people are done. Probably other people are finishing up, so you can go ahead and do that while I'm chatting. If you are not quite done. So obviously today we're going to talk about learning and some of the basic learning principles. And you'll see that most of the time when we've started studying these, we've studied them with animals just because they're a little simpler than humans. There's a lot of videos I'm going to show today, so I'm going to stay seated just because otherwise I'm going to be like up and down and leaning over the computer, and it's just going to be easier for you and for me if I'm just able to click things pretty quickly. So the next series of topics we're going to talk about are like learning and cognition. Learning is the only one that we haven't covered yet that will be on your next exam. So let me go ahead and get the PowerPoint up and screen share it with you all. Oh, I'm gonna try this. Nope. Okay. I think what I need to do is only screen share the slide itself. So I'll have to like do a new share whenever we open a YouTube video, but I am good with that. So, all right, so learning. So we're going to think about how we learn things, how we remember things, how we think, all of that good stuff. And so we'll talk by just talking about learning theory. So learning theory is based on behavior. So what we're really moving into now is the behavioral models of psychology. These folks really thought humans, animals, what have you, are black boxes. It doesn't really matter what's happening in your mind. All that really matters is observable behavior. So these folks really focused on that in particular. And so it's based on the principles of learning. It's based on the responses an organism makes to its environment. And so there are three main theories of learning, and we're going to go over each in a lot more detail as we go through this lecture. Just making sure the chat is up in case anyone has any questions. So the first is classical conditioning, which the main person we'll talk about for that is Pavlov. Then we'll talk about operant or instrumental conditioning. And the main person for that is Skinner. And we'll talk about modeling, which is also called observational learning, which is also called social learning. And the main person for that is Bandura. Now, the really interesting thing about Pavlov is Pavlov was not a psychologist. Pavlov was actually studying digestion in these dogs. He was a physiologist. He actually won a Nobel Prize. And he studied digestion, as I mentioned. So he was the one who kind of stumbled upon this by noticing that the dogs he was working with started to salivate, started to drool before they even tasted the food. So if the food was placed in front of them, if the food was, sometimes even if they heard the footsteps of the people who usually fed them, they would start drooling. And he was really intrigued by this observation, and he pursued the issue with more experiments. So classical conditioning, which is what Pavlov ended up discovering, is a type of learning in which a stimulus that is neutral or has no particular association usually doesn't cause a response. And then it becomes associated or paired with something that does cause a response. So in this case, the food, right? So the food naturally causes dogs to drool when they put it in their mouths. If you pair something neutral, whether it is the sound of the footsteps of the person who usually feeds them or what have you, then that neutral stimulus will start to cause a response on its own. So it explains how a stimulus that really shouldn't cause a reaction, a neutral stimulus, can actually acquire the ability to elicit a response that is usually elicited by something that naturally brings something out of you, like the food for the dogs. And again, the most famous physiologist in this area was Pavlov, and he did his work with dogs. And I do have a hyperlink here. Yes.
Behavioral psychologists have come up with new
And I will reshare so that you all are able to see it.
all concerned about behavior.
So,
Behavioral psychologists have come up with new views, not only of animal behavior, but of human nature as well. And these views all concern a process that we take for granted, learning, because we are all truly born to learn. Ironically, one of the most important figures in the study of learning, Ivan Pavlov, wasn't concerned with the subject at all, at least not at first. Pavlov, a noted Russian scientist, won the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine in 1904.
okay, so people are saying they can't actually see the video, so let me try resharing here.
Behavioral psychologists have come up with new views, not only of animal behavior, but of human nature as well. And these views all concern a process that we take for granted, learning, because we are all truly born to learn. Ironically, one of the most important figures in the study of learning, Ivan Pavlov, wasn't concerned with the subject at all, at least not at first. Pavlov, a noted Russian scientist, won the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine in 1904. As this original footage shows, Pavlov was initially interested in digestion and the action of the salivary glands. By diverting the saliva of dogs into test tubes, he could precisely measure if and how much they salivated during digestion. When food was presented, the dog salivated quickly, an inherited salivary reflex. But over repeated testings, a strange thing happened. The dog salivated before contact with the food. Just the sight of the food was enough to stimulate their drooling. Then, just seeing the food dish, or even hearing the footsteps of Pavlov or his assistants, was enough to trigger this built-in reflex. What was going on to elicit this response? Pavlov decided to find out by systematically varying the stimuli and measuring the dog's reaction. Metronomes, lights, and bells were all used as stimuli, and they all worked as stand-ins for the food. What mattered was not the kind of stimulus that was used, but the fact that it reliably signaled that food was on the way. Pavlov had discovered a fundamental type of learning called classical conditioning. An original stimulus elicits an automatic unlearned response. Both stimulus and response happen naturally. They are unconditioned. Then a second, neutral stimulus that never elicits the unconditioned response by itself is introduced just before the presentation of the original stimulus. If the neutral or signaling stimulus is presented alone, and a response occurs as if the original stimulus were still there, we say that conditioning has taken place. The arbitrary neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. The reverse is also true. Pavlov and others studied the extinction over time of such conditioned responses. When the subject learns that the conditioned stimulus no longer signals a desired event, the acquisition process is reversed, as the learned connection is gradually weakened. Pavlov's work and the work of those who followed him led to a remarkable conclusion, and that is any stimulus an organism can perceive is capable of eliciting any reaction the organism is capable of making.
Okay, so that's enough for you all to get a little bit of the gist of things here. So I am going to try something before I reshare. So right now the screen share should be paused, so if you don't see anything, that's okay. It's what you're supposed to be seeing or not seeing, as it were. So let me... Yeah, I think this will work. Okay. So now if I go this, I think I should be able to just... No, not gonna work. Okay. We'll do it this way. I'll have to reshare every time. But at least we now have figured that out. So it's when I'm in presenter mode in PowerPoint that it causes a bit of an issue. So that's fine. Alrighty, so Pavlov developed this classical conditioning paradigm as a result of the stuff that he kind of just stumbled into with the doggos. And we'll see, and we're going to watch another video about Pavlov in a couple minutes, and we'll see what he was trying to research at that time. So he said that you have this, like, usually you just have a stimulus that is naturally leading to a response. And before conditioning, you have whatever you want to be linked to a response. So, you know, whether that is, in Pavlov's case, the bell he rang before he gave the dogs food, whether it is, you know, something you're trying to, you know, get something to respond to. And let's use the bell example just because it's the simplest. So you have the bell, and if you just ring a bell and you haven't associated it with food, the dog's not going to respond to it any special way, right? If it's a dog that barks at noise, it'll bark at that noise. If it's a dog that doesn't bark at that noise, it won't bark at anything, right? And so if you start to pair the bell with the food every time you ring the bell, then what happens is that unconditioned response, the drooling that you get normally when the dog gets the food, comes to be associated with the bell. So now if you just ring the bell and you don't give the dog food, they'll start to drool. And so this neutral stimulus or potential conditioned stimulus now becomes a conditioned stimulus. All right, and here again is a nice example diagram with the dog included. So you've got that the bell is eliciting the dog drooling. So you pair that stimulus with the food. That's where you get that. Typically, it doesn't happen until you pair the two, right? The food is always going to make the dog drool. The bell will only make the dog drool if it's associated with the food. And again, I think this other video is more helpful for that. So I'm going to go ahead and hopefully open my hyperlink for that. We'll see.
Pavlov's aim was to discover what caused saliva to flow. He rerouted the salivary ducts to the outside of his dog's cheek so that he could collect and measure the spittle.
Okay. So I got to do a new share and go to our Pavlov's plots, and now you should be able to see it.
Pavlov's aim was to discover what caused saliva to flow. He rerouted the salivary ducts to the outside of his dog's cheek so that he could collect and measure the spittle. Perhaps, he thought,
the production of saliva might be the result of a fixed nervous reflex, like a knee jerk.
5 минут 42,5 секунды.
After taking many measurements of spittle, he confirmed that the dogs drooled automatically when their tongues touched food. He called the response the salivation reflex.
4,5. Хорошая собачка. Я предлагаю поменять собаку.
But his work started to run into trouble. As his dogs became familiar with the experimental routine, they started to fill their cheek tubes before Pavlov had a chance to stimulate their tongues. The dogs were learning to anticipate food. Pavlov tried a new technique. He erected screens so that the dogs couldn't see what was going on. Before passing meat through the hatch, he introduced a stimulus that was totally unrelated to feeding. A ticking metronome. At first, the dog dripped saliva into its cheek tube only when the food appeared. But after a number of trials, the dog began to connect the ticking with the arrival of meat. Soon, the sound alone made the dog drool. Eventually, the dog salivated as much to the ticking itself as it did originally to the presentation of food.
Полная. Идите сюда. Что я говорил?
He called this new response the conditioned reflex.
Собака.
Whatever the stimulus, his dogs could soon be conditioned to produce saliva. Pavlov believed that he had discovered how animals learned, even in the wild.
I'm going to try one other thing. I think it's going to be easier if I don't open the PowerPoint as a presentation, and I just share the other screen. So I'm going to give that a whirl and see how that goes, just so I don't have to keep resharing. So now you should be able to see the PowerPoint, but again, with, all the normal ugly stuff around it. So forgive that. But I think this will make it technically easier. So yeah, maybe the dogs were responding to Pavlov like this, but I drool. Pavlov can write in his little book, right? Just kind of a funny thing. So certainly, Pavlov, again, kind of stumbled onto this, right? It's not something he meant to do, but certainly something that contributed a lot to psychology. An example of classical conditioning in humans can be seen from the case of little Albert. So, Watson and Rayner did this study, and they published it in 1920. And I'll give you the conclusion first. This case illustrates the conditioning of a fear response to a rat, a stimulus that had previously been a neutral stimulus to the child. No fear of the rat initially. So little Albert was this little 11-month-old baby that we see here. And he was brought into the lab. He was shown the rat. And he had some interest in it. No real response to it. I'm like, hey, it's an animal. During conditioning, they visually presented the rat to little Albert. And then they would struck a hammer on a suspended steel bar right behind him. So it'd make a huge noise. And in the experiment, it was struck immediately behind Albert's head just as he began to reach for the rat to pet it or play with it. This produced a startle response or a fear-like response in the child. After a number of trials, he developed a conditioned emotional reaction to the rat. The instant the rat was presented to him, he started to cry, understandably. So you might think, so what if a little child is afraid of a white rat? Unless he grows up and works in a lab, this shouldn't present any problems. What's interesting, however, is that Albert's fear showed what they call generalization. So he had the same response to things that were kind of like the white rat. So other furry animals, like a white rabbit, and also a white fur coat. So a fear like this would never have received approval if we had things like institutional review boards today. But what Watson and Rayner concluded is that phobias are conditioned emotional responses to these things. All right, so now I am going to open a video of little Albert.
But not everyone believes that biology is destiny. For many scientists, it's your experiences in life that count. Your upbringing, your education, your environment. Chief among these scientists is psychologist John Watson, who offers a theory that is the mirror opposite of eugenics.
This was the heyday of hereditarians and geneticists who said that human beings were constrained by their genetic inheritance. And Watson was saying that this is baloney, that human beings were shaped solely by their environment.
Over the years, Watson studies the behavior of babies, hundreds of them. To Watson, we arrive in the world a blank slate, tabula rasa. Nearly everything is learned. Even things we think are instinctual, like fear. To prove that environment is more powerful than genetics, Watson designs an experiment for an infant known as Little Albert. He's so confident, he films it for posterity.
So this is little Albert. The person holding him is Rayner. So she was a graduate student of Watson's. And then you'll see the various animals they introduced to little Albert and how he doesn't show any fear response eventually.
At first, Albert shows little fear, even when Watson places a burning newspaper in front of him. Albert is also unafraid when he encounters a white rat for the first time in his life. But then, Watson shows Albert the rat accompanied by a loud clanging noise. One of the few things that upsets little Albert. And he does it again. And does it again. Eventually, Albert learns to fear not just the rat, but all furry things, even without the loud noise. In Watson's mind, the little Albert experiment is a success because it proves that fears are learned, not inherited.
So I don't know if you all could see at the end there, but Watson had like a freaky rabbit mask on. I don't really know what the point of that one was. I think that would freak out anybody, regardless.
I feel so bad for little Albert because he ended up with so many phobias after that.
Well, that's the interesting thing. So there were psychologists who decided to try to find out what happened to little Albert after this happened. So about 90 years later, they decided to try to track him down. And so they went about this in 2 stages. So they wanted to learn as much as possible about little Albert. And then, so they figured out things like when was he possibly born? They looked at who were the volunteers recruited for the study. And then they tried to look for an individual that matched his description. So they tracked down his family. He was the son of a wet nurse, and there were only so many of those around. So if you're not familiar with what a wet nurse is, it's someone who will nurse other people's children while they nurse their own, because women either can't or choose not to nurse their own children. So that baby's real name was Douglas. And they found a family member able to connect them. And they compared the family portrait that the family member provided with the film. They have very similar features. And what they discovered is that Douglas developed a condition called hydrocephalus. This is known as water on the brain. It's a medical condition where there's an abnormal accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid in the ventricles or cavities of the brain. This may cause increased intracranial pressure inside the skull, progressive enlargement of the head, convulsion, and mental disability. And unfortunately, in little Albert's case, it resulted in his death at the age of 5. In little Douglas's case, this was not at all caused by what Watson did. This was something that was genetic, or due to some other natural cause. So, yeah, it was really, it was like, it's the saddest end to a research article I've ever read. At the end, they're like, yeah, we were at his gravestone. Like, we were planning on interviewing his descendants, and this is what we had. So yeah, very, very sad. But unfortunately, not that uncommon, 100 years ago, for children not to make it past childhood. Alrighty, so that is classical conditioning in a nutshell. I mean, if you took a class on learning, you would spend the whole semester almost talking about it, or about operant conditioning, which we'll talk about next. But this is intro, so we do a little thumbnail sketch and we move on. So operant conditioning is most often associated with B.F. Skinner, and this is him up in the corner here. And the idea is that behavior can be understood by examining the relationships between responses and then what follows. So whether or not the behavior is going to be repeated is essentially determined by the contingencies placed on it. So contingencies influence the future likelihood of doing that behavior again. So the likelihood of a response is increased if it's reinforced or rewarded, and it's decreased if it's punished. That makes sense, right? Most people don't really want to get punished for something, and animals too. So, and punishment doesn't have to be anything violent here, right? It can just be something slightly unpleasant. So here's an example with operant conditioning. In any situation, we can do a whole bunch of different responses, right? And if a response that we do is followed by the reward or the reinforcement, so like here you can see this person maybe tried 3 different things, didn't have any consequences, tried this 4th thing, ooh, they got a reward. That's what they're going to do again in the future, right? So then you're going to do that same response again. So example here, let's say you're hanging out with a friend and you're trying on outfits for a non-COVID night out, pre-COVID. So you put on an outfit, and the first time they just sort of ignore you. You try on another outfit and they just sort of shake their head. You try on another outfit and they're again, on their phone, not really paying attention. And you try on a 4th outfit and your friend says, you look great in that one. That looks awesome on you. Well, the next time you go out, you're going to wear something like that, right? And the next time you go shopping, you might buy something more like that. So what are some other ways we can think about this? So one of the classic ways to explain this and to think about it is by thinking about kids and tantrums, right? So, and in this case, it's really more sort of bullying aspect of it, right? So bullying in general is a pattern of maladaptive social behavior, and it's been receiving increasing research attention in the past, I would say 20, 30 years, because it has long-term negative consequences for both the victim, but also for the bully, which a lot of people don't realize. So bullying behavior is probably maintained by several contingencies. First, they get tangible things they want, right? So if we think about the classic bully, that'd be like your lunch money or whatever, right? Second, they also get verbal praise and attention from their supporters. So that's a second reward. So example here is, maybe a kid that didn't start out a bully and they try to get a toy from another kid out. Can I play with it? And the kid just sort of ignores them. It's my turn now. They're even like trying to be polite and share. Nothing. And then they start to get angry. It's my turn now. Nothing. And then they push the kid and grab the toy. Now they have the toy. That's what they wanted all along. So the next time they want another toy, then there's this increased likelihood of aggressive behavior. And the only way to get that to stop is to try to incorporate some sort of punishment, right?
Hmm? Like when they take the toy, they are forced to return it, and then they get in the timeout for taking the toy.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's the only way you can sort of uncondition this, but you have to be careful about how you do that, because what can happen sometimes is kids will act out, not in this scenario, but in other scenarios, kids will act out to just try to get attention, and even negative attention ends up being reinforcing to them because that's what they wanted, right? So you've got to sort of, the best way is to stop it before it ever starts, before that association is made, right? But then you have to be very mindful about how you address these things. So parenting is not easy. It's like the sum of this, this slide. Now, in terms of reinforcement, these are getting a behavior to occur more often. And you do that by rewarding the behavior. And there's a couple different ways you can do that. So positive reinforcers are what we typically think of when we think of reinforcement. You give something desirable, something that they want to make a behavior occur more often. And one thing that's really important to note here is positive and negative here don't have like moral valence. They're just, positive means you're adding something that wasn't there before, and negative means you're taking something away that was there before. So just kind of keep that in mind. So a positive reinforcement could be, if a kid is nice to their sibling, you might give them something, a sticker, some candy, something along those lines, right? Something that they want, nothing overindulgent, right? But just to reinforce that behavior. Negative reinforcement is the one that people sometimes have a hard time wrapping their heads around. So this is the idea of taking something undesirable away to make a behavior occur more often. So by taking something they don't want away, that in and of itself is reinforcing. So an example of this is, again, the kid is being good. They're not aggravating their sibling like they usually do. Okay, you don't have to set the table tonight. I'll do that for you. You don't have to do your chore because, you were very good today. So that's an example of negative reinforcement. You take away something they don't like to do to reinforce that, yes, we want you to keep doing this behavior. So here is an example that may apply for some of y'all. Test anxiety. This is something a lot of students struggle with. And just about everyone is anxious during tests in some way, shape, or form. But some people experience debilitating anxiety during tests. Even though they may know the material very well, their level of emotional arousal may be so high that it interferes with their ability to do well. They'll either just freeze on the test or they'll start doubting themselves. And individuals who are highly anxious, it might start leading to avoidance, where they just don't show up on exam days, which doesn't really solve the problem, right? Because now you're going to get a 0 on the exam. But what happens usually, let's say, is that this person gets, if they go to an exam, they get, feel dizzy, sick to their stomach. They might think that, oh, I have the flu or something like that. So they tell the professor tells them to go home and they can do a makeup later, and they feel much better because their anxiety went down. The next time as they near the classroom, they begin to feel the same thing. So they go home and they feel better, and that avoidance response is strengthened, right? And so this becomes problematic because now you might not even be communicating with your professor about it. And so then again, you're getting these 0s, right? But reinforce because you don't have to experience those negative consequences of anxiety. And in fact, this avoidance piece is a huge part of what maintains anxiety for people. Yes, Carter. So that is an example of what is called positive punishment, which we will get to in a few slides. Actually, we might not get to that till Monday. We'll see. Yes. So in theory, it's child abuse, right? They don't always get caught. Even if they get caught, they don't always go to jail, unfortunately. But yes, corporal punishment, yes, I agree. It's super sad and problematic in a lot of ways. But corporal punishment could be an example of punishment, of a positive punishment. Not that it's a good thing to do. Again, that's not a moral term, but that you're adding something that the child doesn't like. Not something psychologists ever recommend. Even studies about spanking, for example, showed that it leads to a lot of negative psychological consequences. So we do not recommend that at all. There are other ways you can punish. Yeah, it doesn't work. The kid just learns fear. They don't learn not to do the thing. And unfortunately, one of the consequences is what they learn is the way you solve your problems is with violence. And so if they grow up and have a family, they may perpetuate that cycle and hit their own children. So yeah. Yeah, and some schools still use corporal punishment, which is not okay. Yeah, so it's very problematic, but can in theory be used as part of operant conditioning. Again, not something that we as psychologists would ever recommend. Alrighty, so not all reinforcers are made equal. So we get different responses by varying the timing of when we give the reinforcement for a behavior we want to keep going, or when we, how often we give it, the frequency. So the timing, when we give it, so it's better to reward as soon as possible after the activity. And then the frequency, like do we reward every time or just every couple of times, right? So continuous reinforcement is where you get, anytime you do something right, you get the reward. So for a kid, you're potty training maybe, every time they use the potty, they get a sticker on their wall chart or they get an M&M. Partial, or what's sometimes called intermittent reinforcement, is where some of the responses are reinforced. So the idea is it's reinforced, but just not all of them. And then there are different schedules of reinforcement. There are two main categories, ratio and interval. This is, how often you do it, essentially, and the type of way you do the pattern. So ratio schedules, you provide a reward after a certain number of responses. So the best example here, I think, is to think of like rats, because a lot of these early experiments were done with rats. And it was like, they were initially trained, you press a lever and you get a piece of food. Well, then they could change it to a ratio schedule where maybe they have to press the bar 5 times to get that piece of food. Okay? Interval schedule is where you provide the reward after a certain time interval. So sort of no matter what the rat is doing, they get it after 5 seconds. So we're going to go over each of these in more detail, but as you can see, you can have fixed ratio or variable ratio and fixed interval or variable interval. And each of those are going to be helpful in their own ways, depending on sort of what you want to happen. So fixed ratio reinforcement, rewards appear after a certain number of responses. So again, the rat presses the bar 5 times and they get it. Factory workers get paid after every 10 cases of products they have completed. So I'm going to go ahead and open this. I have a very brief video here that shows this. this is a rat in what's called a Skinner box. It's essentially a black box. You put them in just to do the experiments. They wouldn't be kept in these. It was just for the short interval where you did the experiments. If you ever want to see one, ask Dr. Jackson in the psych department, because we actually have one. I'm pretty sure it lives in his office now. And this rat is being rewarded for every 5 times it spins around. So when the light goes on, it gets the food. So that's why it's like interested in the wall right now, because the food's cooking through there. You see, that time it did it more quickly. It said, oh, okay, 5 times and I get food. I will knock this out of the park, right? So they learn pretty quickly based on reinforcement. So that's a fixed ratio. Every X amount of times you get something, right? Or, factory workers getting paid or a bonus for every 10 pieces of product that are completed, for example. A variable ratio when rewards appear after a certain number of responses, but that number varies from trial to trial. And you might be like, why on earth would you want to do this? Well, it keeps the person or the animal engaged because they never know when it's going to come. And so the best example of this is slot machines, right? So slot machines are programmed on variable ratios where, they go off after a certain number of times, but the computer programming changes that every time. So you can sit at that machine and you keep on thinking like, I gotta be due. But, maybe right then that variable ratio is, 20. And then the next time around, it's only 2, right? And then the next time it's 13, right? Like, it's just random. But because you know you're going to get it eventually, you keep putting your quarters into it, right? So I have, I thought I had a hyperlink. I must have gotten rid of this hyperlink because it was actually not a great example. I had an example that was supposed to be variable ratio, and it wasn't actually a good example. So just think of a slot machine. That's the best example of variable ratio. All right, fixed interval is that rewards appear after a certain amount of time, regardless of what the animal or the person is doing. Okay, so maybe the rat presses a thing 20 times. Maybe it presses it 30 times, but it doesn't matter. It matters that 30 seconds have gone by. And a way to think of this is if you're salaried, your weekly or monthly paychecks, right? Like you might take a sick day or a vacation day, but because you have those built into your compensation package, you still get the same check. Variable interval are where rewards appear after a certain amount of time, but that amount of time varies from trial to trial. And so this is things like, your boss might randomly stop by and be like, you're doing a good job, right? Or I think of, I worked at Kohl's in high school and college on breaks, and we had the smile and say hi shopper, where at Kohl's, one of the things you're taught to do is if a customer comes within 10 feet of you, you just have to smile and say hi, and greet them and make them feel welcome. And there would be someone who comes in to do a secret shop just to see if we were doing that. And we never do when that person was commented, right? And so that's an example of a variable interval as well. So what these variable schedules can result in is essentially superstitious behavior. So one of Skinner's experiments examined the formation of superstition in one of his favorite experimental animals, the pigeon. So Skinner worked a lot with rats, but he also worked a lot with pigeons. Skinner placed a series of hungry pigeons, and they don't starve them, they just don't feed them for a day, so that they're hungry when they get in there and they want to eat. and it was attached to an automatic mechanism that delivered food to the pigeon at regular intervals with no reference whatsoever to the bird's behavior. And what they found is that whatever the bird was doing when they got the food, when they got reinforced, they just kept doing it. So one bird was conditioned to turn counterclockwise about the cage, making 2 or 3 turns between reinforcements. Another repeatedly thrust its head into one of the upper corners of the cage. A third developed a tossing response, as if placing its head beneath an invisible bar and lifting it repeatedly. 2 birds developed a pendulum motion of the head and body, in which the head was extended and forward and swung left to right. And it was, again, just whatever they were doing when they got reinforced, even though the reinforcement just came every 5 seconds, in their minds, it was like, well, I'm getting food, so I got to keep doing this thing so I get food, right? And Skinner suggested that the pigeons behaved as if they were influenced by the automatic reinforcement. And he said that this is really analogous to human superstition. And I think the best example of this is baseball. So if you've ever watched a professional baseball game, right, the pitcher will go up and he'll like adjust his hat and he has to do certain things with his ball and he might like lick his thumb, right? He goes through the whole thing. And then the batter might hold up his hand and step out and he's got to tap his shin guards a couple times, right? And he's got to do a couple things. Maybe he has to mess his hat up with his hat. But, you know, like one time when the pitcher did that, they got a whole bunch of strikeouts in a game, right? And one time when the batter did that, they hit a home run. So they keep doing those behaviors, even though most likely they have absolutely nothing to do with their performance. It's a superstitious behavior. So I do have, yes, a video for this that's kind of fun.
Like most living creatures, the pigeon quickly associates the pressing of the lever and the reward. But when a timer releases a seed automatically every 20 seconds, the pigeon wonders, what did I do to deserve this? If it was flapping its wings at the time, it'll continue to flap, convinced that its actions have a decisive influence on what happens. We call this pigeon superstition.
So short little video, but illustrates what we were talking about there, that they would just keep doing whatever they were doing. Alrighty, so there are different types of reinforcers as well. So the ones that tend to be the most effective tend to be primary reinforcers. So these are things that fulfill basic biological needs or desires, such as food or sex, that have an innate basis to an organism. And then there are secondary or conditioned reinforcers, and these are stimuli like money, or if you remember going to Chuck E. Cheese as a kid, tokens, that acquire their reinforcing power by their learned association with primary reinforcers. So you learn that if I get money, I can buy food, right? So that's your motivation. And there are several factors that can influence the effectiveness of reinforcement as well. One is called instinctive drift. And this is the innate response tendencies interfere with learned behaviors. So innate tendencies can override things that you learn through reinforcement. So the best example of this is if you've ever had a cat, trying to teach them not to scratch the furniture, right? Like they'll get it, but then they like go back to it. We actually just had this happen where we're having to get the little sticky tape that doesn't hurt them, but makes them want to not scratch there. Because our cat has been scratching at one of our chairs. It's an instinctive thing. It's something they do in the wild to actually mark their territory. So it's really hard to train out of them. Then there's also what's called the Premack principle, where a preferred activity can reinforce a less preferred activity. So for example, kids will sit quietly in class if they know that it means they'll get to go outside for recess, or whatever that next reinforcer is. So primary reinforcers, secondary reinforcers, both work, but secondary reinforcers really only work because of their association with primary reinforcers. Alrighty. So punishment. I said that we'd get to this, and we actually got to it today. That's good. This is used in order to get a behavior to occur less often by punishing the behavior. So again, positive punishment sounds weird, sounds like an oxymoron, but all it means is that you're adding something that wasn't there before. And in this case, you're adding something that whatever you're punishing, the dog, the kid, whoever, doesn't want. So again, we talked about how corporal punishment, hitting kids, can be used in this way. It certainly should not, right? So that is an example of positive punishment. Negative punishment occurs when you take away something they want, something desirable, to make a behavior occur less often. So again, you're taking away something. That's the negative part, just like the positive is adding. Again, positive, negative are not moralistic here. They're just essentially math functions, adding versus subtracting. So, maybe instead of giving your child any kind of positive punishment, if they hit their brother, you say, okay, can't watch Paw Patrol today, right? So taking away something they want in order to punish them. So both will attempt to decrease the likelihood that a behavior will reoccur. So I'm actually going to stop there today because this example will take probably more than the couple minutes we have left in class. We'll pick up here on Monday, and then we're also spending time on Monday doing a Jeopardy for review as well. And so come with any questions you have about the material too. And we will do that on Monday. I will do my typical sticking around in case anybody has questions today. And everyone have a good weekend. Stay safe, wear your masks.
Oh, when is the test again?
Wednesday, a week from today.
Ah, okay, I have time. Thank you. Bye.
I had a question for you. So, I've been doing pretty well on exams and quizzes and stuff. I definitely have had a grasp on that stuff, but I've fallen pretty far behind on what are they called? The CA assignments.
Mm-hmm.
So I can admit that I haven't really been doing too many of those, but I know that there's some due today. There's a few due today, and then there's a few due on the 19th, and then there's a few due on the 21st. And I was wondering if I should just focus on doing those, or if I should catch up on the ones that I've already missed. What should I prioritize? Because if I already missed a chunk of them, that's gonna mess up my grade anyway. So I was wondering.
Yeah, I would say go ahead and work on the ones that are due now. And then if you want to go back and work on them after that, but yeah, rather sort of get yourself caught up now. Also, those will benefit you for the exam because that material will be on the exam.
Okay, cool. All right. So, and because I haven't done too well with the CA assignments, I know that's it'll tank your grade, but they're not. How much are they worth?
Each of them is only worth 10 points, so it looks like a lot right now, but you've got a ton more in the semester. You've got the final. You've got a lot more points. So it looks bad right now, but yeah, like you said, you're doing well on quizzes, you're doing well on exams, so you can definitely pull that grade up.
All right, thank you. That's all.
You're welcome. Have a good weekend.
You too.